synagogue in the busy marketplace of ancient Athens, where merchants sold their goods and citizens gathered to discuss the affairs of the day, there lived a man who shocked everyone who saw him. This man had no house, no bed, no possessions, except for a simple cloak and walking stick. He lived inside a large clay jar, the kind normally used to store grain or oil. His name was Diogenes, and he was unlike anyone the world had ever seen. People walking through the marketplace would stop and stare at this strange figure. Some laughed, some felt disgusted, and others felt curious about why any person would choose to live this way. Diogenes did not care what they thought. He would sit by his jar, eating scraps of food that people threw to him, drinking water from his cupped hands, and speaking his mind to anyone who would listen. What made Diogenes even more unusual was that he was not a poor man forced into this life by bad luck. He was a philosopher, a thinker who had chosen to live this way on purpose. While other philosophers of his time wore fine robes and lived in comfortable homes, Diogenes rejected everything that most people thought was important. He had no money, no family, no home, and no respect for the social rules that governed everyone else. The people of Athens called him a dog, and Diogenes accepted this name proudly. He said that dogs were honest creatures who lived simply and naturally. They did not pretend to be something they were not. They ate when they were hungry, slept when they were tired, and showed their true feelings without shame. Diogenes believed that humans had become too complicated and artificial in their lives, forgetting how to be natural and free. This strange man with his barrel home would challenge the greatest thinkers of his time. When the famous philosopher Plato tried to define human beings as featherless, two-legged animals, Diogenes found a chicken, pulled out all its feathers, and brought it to Plato's school. He threw the naked bird in front of the students and shouted, "Here is Plato's human being." The students were shocked, but Diogenes had made his point. He showed that clever definitions and abstract ideas often miss the real truth about life. Diogenes lived during one of the most important periods in human history. This was the time when great philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were developing ideas that would influence the world for thousands of years. Athens was the center of learning and culture, where people came from all over the known world to study and debate. Yet in the middle of this intellectual paradise, Diogenes chose to live like a homeless person, challenging everything that his society valued. His philosophy was called cynicism, which came from the Greek word for dog. The cynics believed that most of what people worried about in life was unnecessary. They thought that happiness came not from having more things, but from needing fewer things. While other people spent their lives trying to get rich, gain power, or win respect, Diogenes taught that these goals would only make people unhappy and dependent on things they could not control. In our modern world, where people often feel overwhelmed by the pressure to buy more, achieve more, and be more successful, Diogenes offers a different way of thinking. Today, millions of people work long hours to afford things they think will make them happy. They buy expensive clothes, cars, and houses, hoping these possessions will bring them joy and respect. They spend hours on social media creating perfect images of their lives to impress others. They worry constantly about what other people think of them. Diogenes would look at our modern world and probably laugh. He would see people carrying expensive phones while feeling lonely, living in big houses while feeling empty inside, in working jobs they hate to buy things they do not really need. He would ask why people make their lives so complicated when happiness might be much simpler than they think. The story of Diogenes is not just about one strange man who lived in a barrel over 2,000 years ago. It is about a question that every person must answer for themselves. What do you really need to be happy? Diogenes believed that most people were slaves to their desires, their possessions, and their need for approval from others. He chose to be free by giving up everything that society told him he should want. When people saw Diogenes living in his barrel, some felt sorry for him. They thought he was poor and unfortunate. But Diogenes would tell them that he was the richest man in the world, because he needed nothing from anyone, could sleep peacefully, because he had no possessions to lose, could speak honestly, because he did not need to impress anyone, could be himself, because he did not care about fitting in with society's expectations. This radical way of living was not just about being different for the sake of being different. Diogenes had serious philosophical reasons for his choices. He believed that most human suffering came from wanting things that were not necessary for life. He saw that people made themselves miserable by comparing themselves to others, by wanting more than they had, and by living according to rules that served no real purpose. His barrel became a symbol of ultimate freedom, while other people were trapped in their houses, worried about protecting their property and maintaining their social status. Diogenes could pick up his few belongings and go anywhere he wanted. He owed nothing to anyone and depended on no one for his happiness. The marketplace where Diogenes lived was not just a place to buy and sell goods. It was the heart of Athenian social life, where people came to meet friends, discuss politics, and share news. By choosing to live there, Diogenes put himself at the center of society while rejecting everything that society stood for. He became a living reminder that there was another way to live, a way that most people had forgotten or were too afraid to try. As we begin to explore the life and ideas of this remarkable man, we will discover that his story is not just about ancient philosophy. It is about the eternal human struggle between freedom and conformity, between simplicity and complexity, between being true to yourself and fitting in with others. In a world that often seems to demand more and more from us, Diogenes reminds us that sometimes the answer is not to try harder, but to want less. The world that Diogenes lived in was unlike anything we can imagine today. It was the 4th century before Christ, a time when the Greek city-states dominated the Mediterranean world with their ideas, art, and power. Athens, where Diogenes chose to make his home in a barrel, was the most important city in this remarkable civilization. It was a place where democracy was born, where the greatest minds gathered to think and debate, and where human knowledge reached heights that would not be seen again for centuries. When Diogenes arrived in Athens, the city was still glowing with the achievements of its golden age. Just a few generations earlier, Athens had produced some of the greatest names in human history. Pericles had led the city to its greatest glory. Sophocles and Euripides had written plays that people still watch today. The Parthenon, with its perfect columns and beautiful sculptures, stood on the hill overlooking the city as a symbol of Athenian greatness. But by the time Diogenes began living in his barrel, Athens had also experienced great suffering. The city had fought a terrible war with Sparta called the Peloponnesian War. This conflict lasted for 27 years and left Athens defeated and exhausted. The war had cost the lives of thousands of citizens and had destroyed much of the city's wealth and confidence. Many Athenians began to question whether their old ways of thinking and living were still good. This period of uncertainty and change created the perfect conditions for new ideas to flourish. People were ready to listen to different ways of understanding the world. The old Greek religion, with its stories of gods and goddesses living on Mount Olympus, no longer seemed to provide satisfactory answers to life's difficult questions. Citizens wanted to understand how to live well in a world that seemed increasingly complex and dangerous. Into this atmosphere of questioning and searching came some of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. Socrates, the man who claimed to know nothing but asked questions that made everyone think, had been executed by the Athenian government just a few decades before Diogenes arrived. His death had shocked the intellectual world and made people realize how dangerous it could be to challenge accepted beliefs. Socrates had taught that the most important thing in life was to examine your beliefs and actions carefully. He would walk through the streets of Athens, stopping people and asking them simple questions about justice, courage, and goodness. Through his questioning, he would show that most people did not really understand the things they claimed to believe. His method of teaching through questions became known as the Socratic method, and it influenced every philosopher who came after him. One of Socrates' most famous students was Plato, who was still alive and teaching when Diogenes came to Athens. Plato had founded a school called the Academy, where students came to study mathematics, philosophy, and politics. Plato believed that the physical world we see around us is just a shadow of a more perfect world of ideas. He taught that philosophers should use reason to understand these perfect ideas and should not trust what they learned through their senses. Plato's most famous student was Aristotle, a man whose ideas would dominate European thinking for over 1,000 years. Aristotle disagreed with his teacher about many things. He believed that we could learn about the world by observing it carefully and thinking logically about what we saw. He studied everything from politics to biology, from poetry to ethics. His school was called the Lyceum, and it became another center of learning in Athens. These great thinkers attracted students from all over the Greek world. Young men would travel for weeks to reach Athens, where they could listen to lectures and participate in debates about the most important questions of human existence. The city became a magnet for anyone who wanted to understand the world better. But the political situation in Greece was becoming more unstable. The individual city-states that had dominated Greek politics for centuries were losing their independence. To the north, a new power was rising. Philip of Macedon was conquering Greek cities one by one, and his son Alexander would soon become the greatest conqueror in history. The old world of independent Greek cities was coming to an end. This political uncertainty made many people feel anxious about the future. They could no longer be sure that their city would protect them, or that their traditional ways of life would continue. Some people responded to this uncertainty by becoming more interested in philosophy. They wanted to find ways of thinking that would help them deal with a world that seemed increasingly out of their control. Different schools of philosophy emerged to meet these needs. The Stoics taught that people should accept whatever happened to them and focus on controlling their own thoughts and actions. The Epicureans believed that the goal of life was to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. The skeptics argued that we could never know anything for certain, so we should suspend judgment about everything. It was in this environment of intellectual ferment and political change that Diogenes developed his radical philosophy. He looked at all the different schools of thought around him and decided that they were all making the same mistake. They were all too complicated. They were all trying to find happiness through thinking and reasoning. But Diogenes believed that happiness was much simpler than that. The economic situation in Athens also influenced the development of philosophy. The city had lost much of its wealth during the long war with Sparta. Many families that had once been rich found themselves struggling to survive. The gap between rich and poor was growing wider. Some people lived in luxury, while others barely had enough to eat. Diogenes observed this inequality and concluded that most people were chasing after things that would not make them truly happy. He saw wealthy men who were miserable despite their riches, and he saw poor men who were bitter because they wanted what they could not have. He began to think that both groups were making the same error. They believed that happiness came from external things like money, possessions, or social status. The cultural values of Athens also shaped Diogenes' thinking. Athenian society placed great importance on reputation and honor. Men competed with each other to show off their wealth, their speaking ability, and their knowledge. They wanted to be admired by their fellow citizens and remembered by future generations. But Diogenes looked at this competition and saw only vanity and foolishness. This was the world that produced Diogenes the cynic. It was a world of brilliant minds and beautiful art, but also a world of war, uncertainty, and social competition. Into this complex society stepped a man who would reject almost everything it valued and propose a radically different way of living. Long before Diogenes became famous for living in a barrel, he was just an ordinary young man from a prosperous family in the Greek city of Sinope. This coastal town sat on the shores of the Black Sea, far from the intellectual centers of Athens and other famous Greek cities. Sinope was a trading port where merchants from different lands came to buy and sell goods. Ships loaded with grain, fish, and other products sailed in and out of its harbor daily. Diogenes was born into a world very different from the one he would later choose. His father, Hysasius, was an important man in Sinope. He worked as a banker and money changer, one of the most respected professions in the ancient world. Banking required trust, skill, and a good reputation. People brought their valuable coins to Hysasius, expecting him to keep their money safe and to exchange different types of currency fairly. The family lived comfortably in a nice house with servants to help with daily tasks. Young Diogenes probably wore fine clothes, ate good food, and received the education that wealthy families provided for their sons. He learned to read and write, studied mathematics, and memorized the great poems of Homer that every educated Greek knew by heart. His future seemed bright and predictable. He would likely follow his father into the banking business and become a respected citizen of Sinope. But fate had different plans for the young man. When Diogenes was still relatively young, a terrible scandal destroyed his family's reputation and changed the course of his life forever. His father was accused of a serious crime that would shock the entire city. The charge was currency debasement, which meant deliberately damaging the official coins of the city to steal some of their precious metal content. In the ancient world, coins were made of valuable metals like gold and silver. Their worth came from the actual metal they contained. Currency debasement involved shaving off small amounts of metal from coins or mixing cheaper metals with precious ones when making new coins. This crime was considered one of the worst possible offenses, because it attacked the foundation of trade and commerce that cities depended on. The accusation against Diogenes spread quickly through Sinope. People who had trusted him with their money felt betrayed and angry. Other merchants worried that they might have received damaged coins from him. The city's rulers were furious because currency debasement threatened the reputation of Sinope's money in other cities. If people could not trust coins from Sinopia, trade would suffer and the city would lose wealth and influence. Whether Diogenes was actually guilty or not, the scandal destroyed the family's position in society. People who had once treated them with respect now looked at them with suspicion and anger. Friends avoided them on the streets. Business partners refused to work with them. The comfortable life that Diogenes had known since childhood disappeared almost overnight. The consequences of the scandal were severe for the entire family. They lost their wealth, their social standing, and their future in Sinope. Diogenes found himself facing a choice that many young men in his position would have found impossible. He could stay in his hometown and try to rebuild his reputation slowly over many years, always carrying the burden of his father's shame. Or he could leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere else. Diogenes chose to leave. He packed his few remaining possessions and set out for Athens, the greatest city in the Greek world. This journey was not just a physical move from one place to another. It was the beginning of a complete transformation in how he thought about life, society, and what really mattered for human happiness. The road to Athens was long and difficult. Diogenes had to travel hundreds of miles on foot, sleeping outdoors and finding food wherever he could. He had very little money and no friends or family connections to help him along the way. This forced journey taught him his first important lesson about life. He discovered that he could survive with much less than he had always thought necessary. When he finally reached Athens, Diogenes was no longer the comfortable young man who had left Sinope. The experience of losing everything and traveling as a poor wanderer had begun to change his perspective on what made life worth living. He saw that many of the things he had once considered essential for happiness were actually unnecessary burdens. In Athens, Diogenes sought out teachers who could help him understand the meaning of his experiences. He was drawn to the ideas of Diogenes, an elderly philosopher who had been a student of the great Socrates. Diogenes taught in a place called the Synaxarches, a gymnasium located outside the main city where people of mixed Greek and foreign parentage could exercise and study. Diogenes had developed his own interpretation of Socratic philosophy, while Socrates had focused on asking questions and examining beliefs. Diogenes emphasized the importance of living according to virtue rather than seeking pleasure or comfort. He taught that happiness came from being self-sufficient and not depending on external things for contentment. When Diogenes first approached Diogenes, the old philosopher was not particularly welcoming. He had grown suspicious of young men who claimed to want wisdom, but were really just looking for an easy path to success. Diogenes tested Diogenes by being deliberately harsh and demanding. He made the young man prove his seriousness by enduring criticism and difficult challenges. But Diogenes was not easily discouraged. His experiences had already taught him that life could be hard and unpredictable. He was ready to work for the wisdom he sought. He became a dedicated student of Diogenes, learning not just through words but through example, how to live simply and honestly. Under Diogenes' influence, Diogenes began to develop the ideas that would later make him famous. He learned that most people were unhappy because they wanted things they could not have or because they were afraid of losing things they did have. He saw that social conventions often prevented people from living naturally and honestly. The scandal that had destroyed his family's reputation had seemed like a disaster when it happened. But now, Diogenes began to see it as a kind of liberation. The loss of his comfortable life had forced him to discover what he really needed to be happy. He realized that he had been freed from the burden of maintaining a false reputation and conforming to society's expectations. This transformation from a comfortable banker's son to a radical philosopher did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process of learning, questioning, and experimenting with different ways of living. But the foundation for everything that would follow was laid during these early years of exile and discovery in Athens. The large clay jar that became Diogenes' home was not originally meant for human habitation. It was a pithos, a storage container that normally held grain, oil, or wine. These jars were common sights in Greek cities, standing in warehouses and marketplaces throughout the Mediterranean world. But Diogenes saw something different in this simple vessel. To him, it represented the perfect home because it provided just enough shelter without any unnecessary luxury. The jar was big enough for a man to crawl inside and sleep, but not large enough to stand up in. It had a wide opening at the top and thick walls that kept out the worst of the weather. Unlike a house, it required no maintenance, no furniture, and no decoration. Unlike a room, it could not be locked, so Diogenes never had to worry about losing keys or protecting his possessions. Most importantly, it belonged to no one, so he could not be accused of trespassing or charged rent. Diogenes placed his jar in the agora, the central marketplace of Athens, where all the important business of the city took place. This was not a quiet residential area where he could hide from the world. It was the busiest, noisiest, most public place in the entire city. Every day, hundreds of people passed by his unusual home. Merchants set up their stalls nearby, selling everything from food to jewelry to household goods. Politicians gave speeches from raised platforms. Citizens gathered in small groups to discuss the latest news and gossip. By choosing to live in such a public place, Diogenes made himself a constant spectacle. He could have found a quiet corner somewhere outside the city walls, where he could practice his philosophy in private. Instead, he deliberately put himself on display, making his lifestyle a daily teaching demonstration for anyone who cared to watch. His daily routine was unlike anything the citizens of Athens had ever seen. He woke up with the sun emerging from his jar like some strange creature crawling out of the earth. He had no private bathroom, so he relieved himself wherever he felt the need, just as animals do. He had no kitchen, so he ate whatever food people gave him, or whatever scraps he could find. He had no dining room, so he ate in public, using his hands, and showing no concern for table manners. When he was thirsty, Diogenes would cup his hands and drink from the public fountains. One day he saw a child drinking water the same way and realized that he had been carrying an unnecessary possession. He threw away his drinking cup, saying that a child had taught him a lesson about simplicity. From that day forward, he drank only from his hands or directly from streams and fountains. His clothing was equally simple. He wore a rough cloak that served as both his daily outfit and his blanket at night. The cloak was patched and worn, but it covered his body and kept him warm. He had no changes of clothes, no special outfits for different occasions, and no concern for fashion or appearance. When his cloak became too worn to use, he would find or be given another simple garment to replace it. The people of Athens had very mixed reactions to this strange lifestyle. Some were disgusted by his lack of hygiene and social graces. They thought he was crazy or dangerous and tried to avoid him. Others were curious and would stop to ask him questions about why he lived this way. A few were inspired by his freedom from social conventions and became his followers. Diogenes welcomed all of these reactions. He used every encounter as an opportunity to teach people about his philosophy. When someone criticized his appearance, he would ask why they thought clothing was more important than character. When someone felt sorry for his poverty, he would explain that he was richer than they were because he needed nothing. When someone called him crazy, it would suggest that perhaps the crazy ones were those who spent their lives working for things they did not really need. His barrel became a symbol of his complete rejection of private property. Most people spent enormous amounts of time and energy acquiring and maintaining possessions. They worked long hours to earn money to buy houses, furniture, clothes, and decorations. They worried about thieves stealing their belongings. They competed with their neighbors to have nicer things. They passed their possessions down to their children and expected to be remembered for what they had owned. Diogenes saw all of this as a form of slavery. He believed that people became servants to their possessions instead of their possessions serving them. A man who owned a house had to spend time and money maintaining it. A man who owned expensive clothes had to be careful not to damage them. A man who owned many things had to protect them from thieves and weather. But a man who owned nothing was truly free. Diogenes could go anywhere he wanted without worrying about leaving his possessions behind. He could speak his mind without fear of losing his property. He could sleep peacefully without concern for burglars. He could focus his attention on philosophy and virtue instead of on acquiring and maintaining material goods. The barrel also represented his rejection of social status. In Athenian society, where a person lived, was a clear indication of their wealth and importance. Rich people lived in large houses with many rooms, beautiful decorations, and private courtyards. Poor people lived in small, crowded apartments. Slaves lived in tiny rooms attached to their masters' houses. By choosing to live in a storage jar, Diogenes placed himself outside this entire system. He was not trying to move up the social ladder or compete with others for better housing. He was demonstrating that happiness did not depend on having an impressive address or comfortable living conditions. His sleeping arrangements were particularly shocking to his contemporaries. Most people had beds with soft mattresses and warm blankets. Even poor people tried to create some comfort for themselves when they slept. But Diogenes slept on the hard ground, sometimes inside his jar, and sometimes outside under the stars. He used his cloak as a blanket and his arm as a pillow. This might seem like unnecessary suffering, but Diogenes had a philosophical reason for choosing discomfort. He believed that luxury made people weak and dependent. A person who required a soft bed to sleep well was not truly free because they needed that bed to be happy. But a person who could sleep comfortably, anywhere, was free to go wherever life took them. The barrel lifestyle was not just about having less. It was about discovering what was truly necessary for human happiness, and what was merely conventional expectation. Diogenes did not develop his unusual way of living simply to shock people or gain attention. Every aspect of his lifestyle was based on carefully thought-out philosophical principles. These ideas formed the foundation of Cynicism, a school of thought that would influence thinkers for centuries to come. The core concepts of his philosophy can be understood through four main ideas that guided every decision he made about how to live. The first and most important principle was called autarky, which meant complete self-sufficiency. Diogenes believed that true freedom could only come from needing nothing from the outside world. Most people, he observed, were constantly dependent on other people and things for their happiness. They needed their jobs to provide money, their friends to provide companionship, their possessions to provide comfort, and their reputation to provide self. This dependence made people vulnerable and anxious. A man who needed his job for happiness would live in constant fear of losing that job. A woman who needed expensive clothes to feel good about herself would always worry about affording new outfits. A person who needed praise from others would constantly seek approval and fear criticism. Diogenes demonstrated autarky through his daily actions. When he threw away his drinking cup after seeing a child drink from cupped hands, he was showing that he could eliminate even the smallest dependency. He learned to sleep on hard ground, so he would not need a soft bed. He trained himself to eat simple food, so he would not crave fancy meals. He practiced being alone, so he would not need constant companionship. The goal was not to make life harder for no reason. The goal was to become so self-sufficient that external circumstances could not control his happiness. Whether he was rich or poor, praised or criticized, comfortable or uncomfortable, he could remain content because his well-being came from within himself, rather than from outside conditions. The second principle was parrhesia, which meant fearless speech, or complete honesty. Most people, Diogenes noticed, were afraid to speak the truth because they worried about the consequences. They told their bosses what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed to hear. They agreed with popular opinions even when they believed those opinions were wrong. They hid their real thoughts to avoid conflict or rejection. Diogenes refused to live this way. He spoke the truth as he saw it, regardless of who might be offended or what trouble it might cause him. When he encountered powerful people, he treated them the same way he treated everyone else. He did not flatter the rich or famous just because they had wealth or status. The most famous example of his fearless speech occurred when he met Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world at that time. Alexander had heard about the strange philosopher and came to see him. He found Diogenes lying in the sun outside his barrel, completely relaxed and unimpressed by the presence of the great conqueror. Alexander, who was used to people bowing and showing him great respect, was curious about this man who seemed unafraid of him. He asked Diogenes if there was anything he could do for him, expecting perhaps a request for money or favors. Instead, Diogenes looked up at the emperor and said simply, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." This response shocked everyone present. Here was a man with no possessions, no army, and no power, treating the ruler of the known world as if he were just an ordinary person blocking the sun. But Diogenes was demonstrating that a person who truly needed nothing had nothing to fear from anyone, no matter how powerful they might be. The third principle was anadia, which is often translated as shamelessness, but really meant freedom from artificial social rules. Diogenes observed that many human behaviors that society considered shameful were actually completely natural. Animals ate when they were hungry, slept when they were tired, and mated when they felt the urge. They did not worry about whether these activities were socially acceptable or happened at convenient times. Humans, however, had created complex rules about when, where, and how these natural behaviors could be expressed. Diogenes believed that many of these rules served no useful purpose and actually made people less healthy and honest. He deliberately violated social taboos to show that they were arbitrary and unnecessary. He ate in public because eating was natural and necessary. He relieved himself wherever he felt the need because bodily functions were part of life. He slept in the marketplace because sleep was required for health. When people criticized these behaviors as shameful, he would ask them to explain why natural human needs should be hidden or delayed to satisfy social conventions. This did not mean that Diogenes thought all social rules were bad. He understood the difference between conventions that served a useful purpose and those that existed only because of tradition or vanity. He opposed rules that prevented people from living naturally and honestly, but he supported principles that promoted virtue and genuine human welfare. The fourth principle was asceticism, which meant voluntary poverty and the deliberate rejection of luxury. Diogenes had discovered that having fewer possessions actually made him happier, not sadder. This went against everything that most people believed about the relationship between wealth and happiness. He practiced asceticism not because he thought suffering was good in itself, but because he had learned that luxury created more problems than it solved. Expensive possessions required time and energy to acquire and maintain. They created anxiety about loss or damage. They made people competitive and envious. They distracted attention from more important matters like developing good character and understanding the meaning of life. By choosing to live with almost nothing, Diogenes freed himself from all of these complications. He could focus his mind on philosophy instead of on earning money. He could travel wherever he wanted without worrying about protecting his property. He could be generous with what little he had, because he was not attached to keeping it. His asceticism also served as a form of training. Just as athletes exercise their bodies to become stronger, Diogenes exercised his ability to live without comfort or luxury. He would hug marble statues in winter to train himself to endure cold. He would walk barefoot on hot sand to build tolerance for discomfort. He would fast regularly to practice controlling his hunger. These four principles worked together to create a complete philosophy of life. Autarky gave him independence. Parrhesia gave him honesty. And Anadia gave him freedom from social pressure. Asceticism gave him simplicity. Together, they provided a path to happiness that did not depend on external circumstances or other people's approval. The death of Diogenes did not mark the end of his influence. Instead, it was the beginning of a philosophical movement that would spread across the ancient world and continue to inspire people for thousands of years. His radical ideas about simplicity, honesty, and freedom from social conventions found eager audiences far beyond the streets of Athens, where he had first shocked people with his barrel lifestyle. In the years immediately following his death, other philosophers began adopting and adapting his teachings. These followers called themselves Cynics, proudly accepting the name that had once been used to insult their master. They traveled from city to city throughout the Greek world, living as wandering teachers who owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and the wisdom they carried in their minds. The most famous of these early Cynics was Crates of Thebes, a wealthy man who gave away his entire fortune after hearing Diogenes speak. Crates became so convinced by the Cynic philosophy that he distributed his money to the citizens of his hometown and began living as a homeless wanderer. Unlike Diogenes, who was often harsh and confrontational, Crates was known for his gentleness and humor. He showed that Cynic principles could be practiced with kindness rather than aggression. Crates married a woman named Hipparchia, who also embraced the Cynic lifestyle. This was shocking to ancient Greek society, where women were expected to live quietly in their homes and avoid public attention. But Hipparchia abandoned conventional female roles to live as a philosopher, proving that Diogenes' ideas about freedom from social expectations applied to women as well as men. The Cynic movement spread rapidly because it offered answers to problems that many people were experiencing. The old Greek world of independent city-states was disappearing as larger empires took control. Traditional sources of meaning and security were breaking down. People felt less connected to their communities and less certain about their place in the world. In this environment of change and uncertainty, the Cynic message of self-sufficiency and inner freedom appealed to many individuals who felt lost or displaced. If external circumstances could not be controlled, at least a person could learn to control their own responses to those circumstances. If society could not provide security and meaning, perhaps these things could be found within oneself. The influence of Cynicism was particularly strong on the development of Stoicism, another philosophical school that became very popular in the Roman world. The Stoics adopted many Cynic ideas, but made them more acceptable to people who were not ready to give up all their possessions and live in barrels. Stoic philosophers like Epictetus, who had been born a slave, found great value in Diogenes' teachings about inner freedom. Epictetus taught that a person could be free, even in chains, if they understood what was truly under their control and what was not. He borrowed heavily from Cynic ideas about self-sufficiency and indifference to external circumstances. Marcus Aurelius, who was both a Stoic philosopher and a Roman emperor, also drew inspiration from Diogenes' example. In his personal writings, Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to focus on virtue rather than wealth or status. Even though he possessed both in abundance, he tried to apply Cynic principles of simplicity and honesty to the challenge of ruling an empire. The influence of Cynicism extended beyond philosophy into early Christianity. Many of the first Christian monks and hermits adopted lifestyles that were remarkably similar to what Diogenes had practiced centuries earlier. They gave up their possessions, lived in poverty, and rejected the values of the society around them. Some scholars believe that the Christian emphasis on simplicity and detachment from worldly goods was partly inspired by Cynic teachings that had spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The idea of holy poverty, which became central to many Christian religious orders, echoed Diogenes' belief that happiness came from needing less rather than having more. Christian ascetics who lived in desert caves or simple cells were following a path that the old Cynic had pioneered in his barrel home. But the influence of Diogenes was not limited to the ancient world. His ideas about simple living and freedom from social conventions would resurface again and again throughout history whenever people became dissatisfied with the complexity and artificiality of their societies. During the American Transcendentalist movement of the 19th century, writers like Henry David Thoreau rediscovered many Cynic principles. Thoreau's experiment of living simply in a cabin by Walden Pond was inspired partly by his reading of ancient philosophers, including Diogenes. Like the old Cynic, Thoreau believed that most people lived lives of unnecessary complexity, and that happiness could be found through simplification and self-reliance. Thoreau wrote that the mass of men led lives of quiet desperation, trapped by their possessions and social obligations. His solution, like Diogenes' solution, was to reduce needs rather than increase income. He famously declared that a man is rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to let alone. The influence of Cynic ideas can also be seen in the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, to lead India's independence movement in the 20th century. Gandhi practiced voluntary poverty, owning almost nothing and wearing simple homemade clothes. He believed that true freedom required independence from material desires, and that moral authority came from living according to one's principles regardless of personal cost. Like Diogenes, Gandhi was willing to endure hardship and social criticism to demonstrate his beliefs. He fasted regularly, lived in simple communities, and refused to compromise his values for political advantage. His method of nonviolent resistance was a form of fearless speech that challenged powerful opponents while maintaining moral integrity. Even in contemporary times, the influence of Diogenes can be seen in various social movements and lifestyle choices. The voluntary simplicity movement encourages people to reduce their consumption and focus on experiences rather than possessions. Environmental activists often adopt cynic-inspired lifestyles to reduce their impact on the planet and to demonstrate alternative ways of living. The minimalism movement, which has gained popularity through books, documentaries, and social media, promotes many of the same principles that Diogenes practiced in his barrel. Minimalists argue that owning fewer things leads to greater happiness, more freedom, and reduced stress. They deliberately choose to live with less in a society that constantly encourages people to buy more. Modern critics of consumer culture often sound remarkably similar to the ancient cynic philosopher. They point out that advertising creates artificial needs, that status competition makes people unhappy, and that true satisfaction comes from relationships and personal growth rather than from accumulating possessions. The digital age has created new opportunities for people to experiment with cynic ideas. Social media influencers promote simple living. Tiny house communities demonstrate alternative housing solutions, and online resources make it easier for people to learn about philosophy and alternative lifestyles. The enduring appeal of Diogenes' message suggests that the problems he identified in ancient Athens were not unique to his time and place, but represent ongoing challenges in human nature and social organization. More than 2,000 years have passed since Diogenes rolled his barrel into the marketplace of Athens, yet his message feels more relevant today than ever before. In our modern world of endless advertisements, social media pressures, and climate emergencies, the ancient philosopher's radical experiment in simple living offers wisdom that could help solve some of humanity's most pressing problems. Today's world would probably shock Diogenes more than his barrel lifestyle shocked the ancient Athenians. He lived in a time when most people owned very few possessions, and when the gap between rich and poor, while significant, was nothing compared to the extreme inequality of our current era. If he could see how people live today, he might wonder why anyone thought his simple lifestyle was extreme. The average person in a developed country today owns thousands of items, from multiple sets of clothes to electronic devices to kitchen gadgets they rarely use. Many families have more stuff than they can easily fit in their homes, leading to the growth of storage unit industries where people pay monthly fees to house possessions they do not actually need. The irony would not be lost on Diogenes that people work extra hours to earn money to store things they never use. Our relationship with possessions has become so complex, and many people feel overwhelmed by the task of managing everything they own. They spend weekends organizing closets, searching through drawers for items they know they have but cannot find, and feeling guilty about waste while simultaneously buying more things they do not need. Diogenes would probably ask why anyone would choose to live this way when freedom was available simply by wanting less. The environmental crisis that our planet faces today makes Diogenes' message about voluntary simplicity even more urgent. Climate change is largely driven by overconsumption and the endless pursuit of economic growth that requires people to buy more products every year. The planet simply cannot sustain a lifestyle where billions of people constantly acquire new possessions and throw away old ones. If Diogenes were alive today, he would probably point out that the same system that promises happiness through consumption is destroying the natural world that sustains all life. He would ask whether it makes sense to work jobs that stress people out so they can buy things that clutter their homes, while participating in activities that damage the only planet we have to live on. Modern technology has created new forms of the dependencies that Diogenes warned against. Social media platforms are designed to make people crave likes, comments, and shares from strangers. Many individuals check their phones hundreds of times per day, feeling anxious when they cannot access their digital connections. They have become dependent on external validation in ways that would have seemed impossible to the ancient. Cynic Diogenes would probably see smartphones and social media as perfect examples of how people create unnecessary needs and then become slaves to those needs. He would ask why anyone would choose to carry a device that constantly interrupts their thoughts and demands their attention. He might suggest that true freedom requires the ability to be alone with one's own mind without feeling the urge to check for messages or updates. The modern economy depends on people believing that happiness comes from buying things, getting promoted, earning more money, and achieving higher status. Advertising industries spend billions of dollars every year to convince people that they need products they never knew existed. This creates a cycle where people work longer hours to afford lifestyles that advertisers have convinced them they should want. Diogenes would probably find this situation both tragic and ridiculous. He would point out that the same energy people spend working for money to buy things they do not need could be used for activities that actually bring satisfaction, spending time with friends, learning new skills, helping others, or simply enjoying the natural world. The housing crisis in many modern cities provides another example of how Diogenes' insights remain relevant. People often spend half or more of their income on rent or mortgage payments for homes that are much larger than they actually need. They work stressful jobs to afford housing costs, leaving them with little time or energy to enjoy the homes they are paying so much for. Diogenes would probably ask why people accept this trade-off. His barrel home met his actual needs for shelter, while leaving him free to spend his time on activities he found meaningful. Modern alternatives like tiny houses, co-housing communities, and house-sharing arrangements offer ways for people to reduce housing costs and increase their freedom, following principles that the ancient cynic would recognize. The mental health crisis affecting many developed countries today might also interest Diogenes. Rates of anxiety and depression have increased dramatically in recent decades, despite improvements in material living standards. Many people report feeling empty, meaningless, or disconnected, even when they have achieved conventional markers of success, like good jobs, nice homes, and comfortable incomes. Diogenes would probably suggest that this unhappiness comes from pursuing goals that cannot actually provide lasting satisfaction. He believed that people who base their self-worth on external achievements would always be vulnerable to disappointment and insecurity. Only those who found meaning within themselves could achieve stable happiness. The rise of mindfulness meditation, yoga practices, and other techniques for reducing stress and finding inner peace shows that many people are rediscovering truths that Diogenes taught through his example. These practices often emphasize letting go of attachments, accepting present circumstances, and finding contentment without needing to change external conditions. Modern minimalism movements explicitly draw inspiration from philosophers like Diogenes. People who choose to live with fewer possessions report feeling less stressed, more focused, and more connected to their real values. They discover that reducing their stuff often increases their satisfaction, exactly as the ancient cynic predicted. The coronavirus pandemic that disrupted normal life around the world gave many people unexpected opportunities to experiment with simpler lifestyles. When lockdowns forced people to stay home and reduce their activities, some discovered that they did not miss the busy schedules and constant consumption they had thought were necessary for happiness. If Diogenes could speak to our contemporary world, he would probably offer both criticism and hope. He would criticize our obsession with material success and our willingness to sacrifice our health and relationships for economic goals. But he would also point out that every individual has the power to choose a different path. His barrel was not just his home, but a statement that happiness does not require what society insists we need. His life poses questions that each person must answer for themselves. What do you really need to be happy? Are you free? Or are you enslaved by your possessions, your schedule, and your need for approval? What would you do with your life if you stopped worrying about what other people thought? These questions do not have easy answers, and Diogenes would not expect everyone to live exactly as he did. But his example shows that radical alternatives to conventional lifestyles are possible, and that sometimes the path to freedom leads through giving up rather than acquiring more.